I was thinking. I mean, we follow five characters through the book, through the events, and at no point are any of them in control of any of the events. And in fact, the politicians themselves aren't that much in control. The husband of a president dies. There's a little group of people who are scheming away in a back room because they don't like the way things are going in one direction, so they do their best. Things backfire, things misfire. And all of this came from, I'm very interested in history anyway, and all this came from reading history and how history is actually not controlled by the people. You know, because we always write history retrospectively and impose a story on and a narrative on stuff that happened after the event. You know, it's a saying that history is always written by the victors, and they obviously impose their narrative on the thing. You know, there was a just war, we defeated the bad people, and look, things are much better. It's always the simplistic view of history. It's the kind of history I was taught as a kid. You know, the British Empire is a great thing, blah blah. We brought all kinds of lovely stuff to the benighted areas of the world that otherwise wouldn't have had the benefits of our civilization.
Romania as well.
Yeah, and every nation I think has that kind of version of the story, right? The Americans were just enacting, and their allies were just enacting that very same narrative all over again in Iraq. So I was thinking about that quite a bit when I was writing that. And it seemed to be that nobody was actually in control. Once it started, nobody could stop it. You know, we had votes in Parliament, we had marches, but nobody could actually stop it. So it's kind of interesting. It was going to happen. There was some kind of crisis, there was some kind of clash of ideology, as I say, and that came out. And the trigger for the rebel was obviously 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11, but it went there anyway. And as I said, worked out a trigger for that, which was simply the death of a moderating influence on this president.
Also kind of saying, or wondering at least, if people have like a war gene somewhere, they can not work towards, as we expect, they're not working towards their own happiness, but somehow this gene of war is getting ahead of the good intentions.
Yeah, well, it's
right.
Well, it's a sort of large. We're okay in small groups, but we're not very good in big groups. So we're okay in villages, we're not okay in cities. We make our own little villages. The best cities are those which will, like London and New York and so on, which have a kind of villagey structure in a way. Although that's in New York, that's less and less now. But we're not very good on mass. You know, sometimes we are. I mean, there's very good things going on in New York at the moment, protesting against police brutality, and they're gathered together doing things peacefully en masse, so it can work, but quite often we're not. And I'm from the generation where I remember the First World War through the stories that were told by grandparents. My grandfather was in the First World War. He didn't talk about it much, but I got it from other people. He fought in Palestine and then in France, and it didn't do him much good at all. Britain was gripped by a mass hysteria. Britain actually didn't have to go to war in the First World War. We had no particular interest in doing it, but we went to war anyway.
There was a little something in World War I, which is not in Romanian textbooks. The Christmas truce, on Christmas Eve in 1914, they made a film about that a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it is a very impressive event to read about how soldiers on both sides sang Christmas carols to each other and fraternized and buried their dead together
And played
so
football
on.
game.
And they don't teach that in France, they don't teach that in Germany, but they teach that in Britain, and I think it's a very important historical event.
Yeah, but it didn't stop the war. Oddly, it happened. It was Christmas 1914, I think. So it's very early on in the war. It didn't stop the war at all.
It stopped the war at the front.
Well, for 2 days.
Between Christmas Eve and New Year's Day.
Oh, is it that long?
That was quite a long.
Yeah. No, and the other thing, the interesting thing about that is that it stopped it in the sense that those guys refused to shoot at each other anymore. So all they did was they said, right, we march you 25 miles down the line this way, and you guys can go 25 miles that way. Who are those guys? I don't know, never met them in my life. Right, okay, and people went back to killing each other because they were no longer facing the people they knew. So it was, I mean, it was very, if you're interested in human genetics, for example, and how humans behave, it was very instructive because it's saying basically you can conduct a war very efficiently so long as you never really get to know the enemy. As soon as you start to get to know the enemy, you're in trouble.
They had football matches together,
Yeah.
they made friends between Brits and Germans, they visited each other after the war in some cases.
Well, the other thing is, of course, prior to the war, there wasn't any animosity between Germany and Britain. In fact, culturally they were getting on quite well, and you had an enormous amount of friendships pre-existing before the war, and most of those survived the war. You know, everyone sort of went, oh well, we've got to kill each other for a bit, and then they stopped. So we're like, oh well, we'll go back to being friends again. And I think, in a sense, the Second World War was a tougher gig because it was a just war in the way that the First World War wasn't. Because you can actually look at the Second World War and say, yeah, that's one we had to fight. You know, it wasn't clear at the time maybe, but it's, and I think that was a much tougher gig for people who maybe had friendships across the lines, because you weren't able to just basically view it as a case of, oh, it just so happens you're on the opposing side in a conflict between equals.
And there was less hysteria in the general population about the reasons for the Second World War, because you didn't need to convince them.
No, they were being bold, which
which does help when convince people they need to fight back. But in the Iraq War, Saddam Hussein was turned into this kind of cartoon. Well, he already was a cartoon character, but he became this absolute cartoon baddie. You know, this kind of this James Bond evil guy. And then as soon as the Allied forces rolled into Baghdad, the first thing you saw were pictures of his palaces. You know, to say, look, this guy. Look, this guy really is a bad. Oddly enough, they had fancy novel colours in them as actual fancy American fancy novels. He'd taken them and said, well, that looks great on the wall of my giant marble palace. I'll have a reproduction of that. So he was living the dream as a megalomaniac dictator in a way, but that still wasn't an excuse. That was then used as a retrospective excuse for the war in a way, to say, look, this is how bad this guy was. But the Americans already knew how bad that guy was because he was their ally beforehand. And this is one of the interesting things. And this is one of the things I was playing around with in the Quiet War in a way. It starts off with them trying to be friends, and there's this thing, but it's diffused, it's sabotaged. For purposes that are never quite clear. It's just because there is one set of people who don't like it. And one of the characters is peripherally involved with that set of people. We never see it as a conspiracy. I wasn't out to write a conspiracy novel. Just as I don't think there was a conspiracy to go to war in Iraq. There was never a room where everybody had secret handshakes. These things are always sort of fall out of the, it seems that's the way things emerge, that's the way things set. And then once you set down that path, we're kind of locked in, which is our big failing. That we can't see, on either side, we can't see other branches, other possibilities.
This is what you meant by the Quiet War, actually. It's the sabotage, it's the propaganda, it's
there's preparation.
There's an interesting book that was written by a lieutenant colonel, I forgot his name now, in the US Army. It's not very high rank, but he was in a think tank, and he wrote about net war, which is basically what the Quiet War is, which is exactly that, which is doing all kinds of things to destabilize regimes. It's the kind of thing the CIA were trying to do in South America under Reagan, but more focused and more strategic than simply, messing around with blocking toilets and things like that, which is what the CIA had. I've got the CIA handbook for destabilizing stuff.
Why did you choose Brazil to be? Why did you choose Brazil
to be
the big power?
Because I decided I didn't want it to be in what's used to be known as the First World in Europe and America, because it's always, when I was a kid growing up, it was always America was going to be the thing in space. Star Trek, which I was a big fan of when I was a kid on television, was supposedly multinational, but their culture was entirely American. So I just thought, well, let's have something else. Let's look for an emerging nation, and Brazil was very interesting. Emerging nation, although, Brazil, I call it Greater Brazil. Greater Brazil does include America. I mean, one of the characters comes from Greater Brazil, but he's Texan.
Those continents, if I understood correctly, the map.
Yeah.
They were covering.
Yeah, I could have done that. Yeah.
Yes.
Don't ask me about Canada. I didn't get into where I think Canada was still Canada, basically. Yeah. This gets back into the thing of
Maps.
Creating a future. Creating a future is exactly the same as creating a fantasy world in a way. Okay, you're starting from the present, but things are changing into the future in the same way when you're writing a fantasy novel. You're keeping the laws of physics. Well, actually, in yours, you mess around with the laws of physics in yours, don't you?
Yeah.
Yes. In a way that works for the story.
Your political map, you mentioned Sharia state.
Yeah, I mean, most of my writing has driven by rage, really, and that manifests itself in political terms. That manifests itself as a sort of a revulsion against all the manifestly stupid things that people do. But mostly what it's about, obviously, is power, because the whole issue is this agglutinative process of power gathers in places, and then obviously it doesn't like to be taken apart again. Hegemony, I guess you could call it. And I kind of, I'm looking for things, basically, I'm looking for things that I'm angry about. And obviously, at the time that I was writing Walter Carbon, which was the late 90s, all through the 90s, it's interesting because no one spotted it at the time, but of course after 9/11 it suddenly became apparent that there had been this kind of surge of resurgence, really, of Islamic fundamentalism. And we'd seen it with the Rushdie affair, and it was very quiet. It was going on, but it was going on in parts of the world that most people weren't very interested in, and so you didn't pay much attention unless you were a foreign policy geek, if you were into that. But yeah, one of the things that had become quite apparent was that this whole fundamentalist wave in Islam was very, very anti-female. That was one of the things it was carrying it. And I'm a feminist, and the quickest way to make me angry is to show me oppression of women. There are other ways. You can show me oppression of other, ethnic groups or whatever. But oppression of women it's the easy one, because there's so much of it. It goes on everywhere. I have a horrible suspicion it's hardwired into us. I think it probably exists at genetic levels. This kind of assumption that women are slaves. And so that obviously became one of the things. It's like, okay, so what am I going to take aim at? Okay, so obviously Sharia law. So we have a world, we never really go there, but it's in the background, this world that is called Sharia, and the assumption is that that's being run by an Islamic fundamentalist state of some sort. And of course...
It was a great prediction, actually, because now